I grew up watching Dragon Ball Z.
Unfortunately, I grew up with like Happy Gilmore and stuff, so.
And I was born in '88, so I grew up in the '90s.
I've always liked Superman because I grew up liking the original films with Christopher Reeve. I definitely think if you have not seen Broken Arrow that you should give it a chance. And if maybe you grew up with it or saw it when you were a kid and you're like, this movie's whatever. And definitely if you're like a sci-fi dork fan like I am and you grew up with films like in the 80s and 90s that just meant something to you.
And because I grew up watching that.
I grew up watching the Die Hard films and I was sad because I love Jim Carrey. You know, I grew up with him in the 90s. I grew up watching Winnie the Pooh, the television show. I grew up watching Dragon Ball Z. And I think it's because I've grown up really close to a Japanese family that I've known my whole life. And young little Link, you grow up with this kid. I've always really liked Superman growing up. I've grown up with Joseph Gordon-Levitt since Angels in the Outfield. Young age, she grew up. I've always kind of liked Joseph Gordon-Levitt. You know, I grew up with him because as I was a kid growing up, I always loved movies. I mean, Star Wars, The Princess Bride, Toy Story, Lion King. Loved movies as I grew up as a kid. I grew up with The Muppet Show. It's just such a fun, good movie that I grew up with from the 90s and it just reminds me of my childhood. I grew up with two older sisters. Now, I grew up with this film, and let me try to explain something to you. The reason I grew up with this film is because my sister loved it. As you guys know, I'm a big fan of Dragon Ball Z. I grew up with the show. I love CG animation. When it works, but there's something about traditional animation that will always be closer to my heart, probably because I grew up with it. You know, I grew up with Dr. Seuss books. In fact, I have a stack of them in my closet right now that I could bring out and it would be pretty embarrassing. If you're a fan of the original films, if you grew up in the 90s, I'm sure this movie will be a lot of fun for you too. It's fun to see Will Smith back. I really like Will Smith. I've liked him. I grew up with him in the 90s. It's a funny movie. I grew up with that one too. I love that movie.
Total Recall is a film that I've been curious about because I'm a huge fan of the original movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger. I grew up with it. See, I've always loved baseball movies. When I grew up, The Sandlot, Field of Dreams, The Natural. These are movies that I watched over and over again. A young girl killed both of her parents, and now the son is living there, and he's quiet, and he's estranged, because obviously he grew up with that. But you're supposed to feel for the kid, you know, because he's grown up in this life. See, I grew up with arcade games, and NES games, and Super NES, and N64, and everything. And that's just a really fun little thing for people like me, you know, who grew up with these characters and everything, to see them there. Coming in at number 3 is basically the Bond that I grew up with. And like any random idea as I grew up, it was like, guys, get over here right now, we gotta make this short film, it's gonna be awesome. I think it just has something to do with growing up with older parents. Currently, both of my parents are in their 60s, and so, you know, as I grew up, my parents were older and I sort of took on their olderisms, and as I grew up, I was able to articulate my thoughts on film well because of that, I think. So I owe a lot to my parents, to be honest. I grew up with it, first of all. I would watch this film endlessly. At number 4, we have the third and final film on my list that I group into a category. She grows up to be a slutty porn star who's dating Trey Songz. That show was actually pretty funny. I don't think it was just because I was a kid and I grew up with it. And he'd like to know, was I a fan growing up and if it meant anything to me. Yeah, I watched like every episode of that show growing up. It was like a thing with me. This is a man who's a fan of Star Wars. Okay, this is somebody who grew up with it. These two little kids get lost in the woods, their parents abandon them there. They of course find the house made of candy and there's a witch there and stuff goes down, except it goes down a little bit differently like it does in the classic fairy tale, and eventually these kids grow up to be witch hunters. The show inspired me a lot as a kid, and it was something that continued to inspire me as an adult when I grew up. I like to invert my controls because I grew up when first-person shooters were pretty much all inverted on the Nintendo 64. You know, a giant beanstalk rose up and Jack climbed it and all that stuff went down. But these guys are friends. They grew up together. They discovered magic together when they were kids. I grew up with that guy, watching every comedy he did, laughing my butt off until I was crying. So I grew up with the Tomb Raider games and even the Tomb Raider movies as well. Jurassic Park is a movie that I grew up with and it meant a lot to me as a kid. But as I grew older and into my teens, I started getting really into short filmmaking. As I grew up, I started to watch Roger Ebert's TV show, and Armageddon is just cheesy 90s fun, but I grew up with it on VHS tape, so it doesn't really bother me in that way. I grew up with Dragon Ball Z. Seeing that in the theater was so incredible because I've grown up with this film. I played so many games growing up, you know. See, I really like Will Smith a lot. Like, I've grown up watching all of his movies. It's kind of like how when I grew up and I was a teenager, it's funny because I am a gamer and I grew up being a gamer. His comedies were kind of similar back then, you know, they were very sophomoric. I don't know if it maybe was because I grew up with it or not. And it's just kind of a special thing for me. Maybe I saw it on the right day. Maybe I grew up watching it. A lot of people like this movie if you grew up with it in the 80s, if you watched it as a kid. To me, it's a special movie. It's just incredible. Now, here's another film that I grew up with that is actually one of my favorite movies also. I really enjoyed The Fugitive. It's definitely a movie I grew up with. You guys know I enjoy this movie. I think it's a lot of fun, and I grew up watching Independence Day. Now, once again, we come to a film that I like because I grew up with it. I really like Jumanji. I grew up with it. That's probably why. This next film for me is a childhood classic. I watched this film like once a week growing up. Next, we have another film that is most definitely a guilty pleasure for me that I grew up with.
As far as the original RoboCop film goes, I enjoy it. I never really grew up with it or anything.
Now, this next game I actually didn't play as much when I was a kid, but I became more of a fan of it as I grew up.
He respects this older guy. He wants to be him. He wants to grow up and just be just like him.
I mean, I grew up watching Stallone movies. I grew up watching Schwarzenegger movies. I love Charlie Brown. I've grown up with him. It's a thing from my childhood, and if you haven't checked it out, you probably won't enjoy it as much if you didn't grow up with it. What did you think of that little intro? I wonder if some of them got it. It probably helps if you grew up in the 90s. It's one of those shows that kind of helps if you grew up with it. So we've grown up next to Jeffrey Dahmer and in Elm Street. When I grew up, to get a whole bunch of extra content, you had to beat the game. So these two sisters, they grew up together in this castle. Now, in case you guys didn't know, I did grow up watching Dragon Ball Z. This Hey Arnold little toy with Abner, his pig, my favorite show in Nick growing up. There are always going to be fanboy complaints and people who are like, well, it has to be this way and it has to be that way because this is how I grew up with it. But it's really in the backstory where you watch her as a youth growing up with Colin Farrell as her father. I love the original. It's a film that I grew up with a lot as a kid. I grew up watching the Jack Ryan movies. I am excited to see some Dinobots because I grew up watching Beast Wars in the 90s. And that is so cool because I grew up playing with Legos. Kevin Costner plays a secret agent who didn't really have that much time to spend with his daughter, Haley Steinfeld, as she grew up. I've been a Godzilla fan my whole life. I grew up watching the older ones on VHS tapes. I mean, The Matrix! The Matrix, for goodness sakes, the Wachowski brothers were attributing Asian and Kung Fu films they obviously grew up on. I really love the Muppets. I grew up watching the Muppets. Yeah, these comic book characters you grew up with, they're pretty awesome, and we're gonna sell them as actual people. I like women. Women are cool. I grew up with two sisters. I grew up with Major Payne. These are the things I grew up on. I watched the 60s Adam West show when I was young. I grew up with the Tim Burton films and the animated series. I've loved Godzilla ever since I was a kid, and even when I was a little kid, I did like the American version. Then I grew up and realized it's really not that great. Because I grew up with the X-Men franchise. However, as the years go by and as this young girl grows up, because let's face it, things like this are gonna happen as we grow up.
Movie critic is a term that I always grew up with.
I love manga. I'm a fan of anime, if you can't tell. I grew up watching anime. There is a lot of stuff going on under the surface in regards to the way the film handles family backgrounds and growing up and maturing. Now, I grew up with the Four Seasons. I don't know if you guys ever watched this, but I grew up with it. I grew up watching Beast Wars. I grew up playing with Transformers. I'm a Transformers fan. The X-Files, my favorite television show ever as I grew up. What this film is about is a young kid growing up. He was going to make a whole bunch of short films over the course of 12 years to show this boy growing up. Now, if you guys didn't know, I grew up watching Dragon Ball Z. This guy is so biased. He grew up with that thing. I also grew up watching the original Star Wars trilogy, and I love them. I grew up watching Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z, and I do love them. Now, if you grew up in the 90s at all, unless you grew up with those films, they're probably not going to be all that amazing to you because they're really just a slice of nostalgia from your childhood. Kids who grew up with this movie will go back and watch the one from the 90s and think it looks like crap. This guy meant so much to me growing up. I can't tell you how many times I watched Hook growing up. Growing up, Jumanji was always on replay in my house. But nevertheless, Robin Williams' portrayal of some of these characters as I grew up, that was one of the first times growing up where I saw someone who was primarily viewed as a funny guy. Being able to escape into some of Robin Williams' films growing up, I dealt with a lot of guilt growing up. I grew up watching the Incredible Hulk television show. My favorite Pierce Brosnan Bond, GoldenEye. And not just because I grew up with the game and whenever they walk into a room I'm like, oh, that's the facility. Oh, that's the bunker. For me, an 80s and 90s kid growing up on Super Nintendo and N64, this movie was perfect. It's Michael Jordan. I grew up in the 90s. Spider-Man, when I grew up, was actually my favorite superhero. I loved everything Spider-Man. I grew up on them. They're nostalgic for me. That everyone, when I grew up, said no matter what. Bats is a movie that I grew up with. I grew up with the first Dumb and Dumber, directed by the Farrelly brothers, starring Jim Carrey and Jeff Daniels. Even though Home Alone 2 is entertaining because I grew up with it, as this girl grows up in the wilderness, you see her enjoy life. I grew up with it. I grew up with the Hobbit cartoon from the 70s. Now, growing up, I loved RC cars and Legos and games. Growing up, I have had a friend who was gay. You can actually watch people grow up and grow older. Why is this on my list? Because I grew up reading these books. I grew up watching a television show. I grew up with Snoopy and Charlie Brown. I grew up with the Charlie Brown and Snoopy show in the 80s. I absolutely adore Charlie Brown and Snoopy and all that. I grew up with that. The store owner has essentially seen me grow up. I grew up watching these movies. Now, I grew up watching the original Batman show. It was hilarious. These are the kind of things that we never thought we'd get to see as comic book fans growing up. Even gave Tom Cruise a folder depicting photographs and locations of his childhood growing up. Now, when I grew up, I loved this movie. I thought it was so great. But then as I grow up and get older, I would start to recognize the more deeper elements of the film. It would grow on me in a different way. I've had no problems with it. Maybe it's because I grew up playing a lot of arcade racers as a kid and I'm just used to that type of feel. I don't know. When I grew up, it was like Superman 64, Batman Dark Tomorrow. I mean, that's the kind of superhero games we had when I was a kid. When I grew up, Superman was like the greatest thing in the world, and Batman was even better. But still, as a Superman fan, as someone who grew up loving the Christopher Reeve films and grew up loving the animated series from the 90s, some of you may not remember those games. I do, because I grew up playing them. This movie was made for me, because for some reason, they think I will like that because I grew up playing all the Donkey Kong games, and is the 5th entry in the Mission Impossible franchise, a franchise that I've had the privilege to grow up watching. As some of you may know, I grew up with Dragon Ball Z. I've always loved Dragon Ball Z. I grew up in this time period. I grew up in Akron, Ohio. He, similar to me and my friends growing up, made tons of movies with each other, and I made a lot of short films with my friends growing up. It's still Star Wars to me because that's how I grew up watching this film. This guy is basically the king of my childhood. He made some of the greatest animated cartoons when I was growing up. Tons of people grew up with it just like I did. He's grown up. What if Peter Pan grew up? The one boy that never grows up. And that could be due to the fact that kids who grew up with it are now adults, like myself. So I was excited to see this movie because I grew up loving Peter Pan. As a fan of Peter Pan, as someone who grew up loving this story, I could not stand this film. I grew up being able to just pop in the next VHS tape. Now, as I said, growing up, my dad used a lot of lines from this movie to teach me certain things, and I myself grew up reading. I grew up watching the original TV show as well. If you were a fan of the books like I was growing up, now in the 90s growing up, but as someone who grew up appreciating Goosebumps, if you guys grew up reading Goosebumps, and we hear him talking about the fact that he grew up knowing one thing and one thing only, which is more than likely being a stormtrooper. Growing up, I loved Goosebumps books. I loved writing scary stories. I grew up with the Charlie Brown and Snoopy show. I grew up with every single special that was ever made. So it was like the prime experience, like Return of the Jedi with my family, how I grew up watching it. There is adult humor thrown in that's going to go over the kids' heads, and when they're older, they're going to grow up and realize, oh, I like that part. Now I understand everything. I mean, I grew up with them, and it's kind of nuts to see how far they've come. That was me fanboying over Spider-Man because I've grown up with Spider-Man. I love Spider-Man. I grew up with Dragon Ball Z. I love Dragon Ball Z. This is a girl that she grew up with together. I grew up with Nintendo games. I always loved the Mega Man games growing up, and I'm going to leave him there because I grew up playing the Donkey Kong Country games for Super NES as well as Donkey Kong 64. Tons of great new people mixed with the old original cast that we grew up loving. Now, I grew up loving the original trilogy. When we grew up, we could just pop in the next VHS tape after Empire Strikes Back ended that no one does because they were so well made and we grew up watching them. I grew up playing a lot of the games that this movie is paying homage to. I mean, think about it. This is a guy who grew up playing with action figures of Luke Skywalker. Anakin was a slave who hoped to grow up strong and liberate his family and friends. I grew up loving this character. We grew up watching the X-Files and gross creature, gory, bloody stuff. So, like, you know, she's not like that kind of woman. I love Tobey Maguire as Spider-Man, not just because I grew up with it. I specifically watched this film. I grew up playing the Lara Croft games.
I grew up with Dragon Ball Z just like you did.
And when I was growing up, I do remember hearing just slight whispers of certain things like this. It could be a video game that I grew up playing that I loved, or a video game I grew up playing that I hate. Yeah, I grew up watching it in the 90s. I mean, I grew up loving these guys. I grew up wearing Superman, like, underwear outside my jeans, running around the house.
I still do.
And growing up, I went to this place called Discount Drug Mart. It's this store in Ohio that actually still does rent movies even today. I love that movie. I grew up watching it. It came out in 1967. It's about a blind woman whose home is being invaded by three men who want something inside of her house. See, I grew up with the 1994 live-action adaptation, which today doesn't hold up as well. But I can tell you that if I was 12 years old today and I saw this movie for the first time, I would grow up telling everyone it's a classic. It would be my definitive Jungle Book movie. My friends, however, growing up, loved Ratchet and Clank, but I went into it excited, actually, because I liked these characters growing up. That when I grew up, in fact, when I was a teenager, for goodness sakes, I never imagined a movie like this would ever exist. Because when I was a kid growing up, Batman was my favorite superhero, then Superman,
than Spider-Man. I grew up when Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were the shit. When I grew up, superhero movies were in a strange time period, and that boy grew up to be the president.
Right. I remember growing up as a kid, and I actually liked the concept, and I thought it was a decent film, like 6 out of 10-ish, maybe. And you grew up with it, and it was so good.
She plays the president's daughter, who in Independence Day was played by the very young Mae Whitman, who's grown up to be a very talented actress. If you are a fan of Tarzan, like if he is a character you grew up with, or maybe you love the Disney animated film from 1999, it is a family film that I think kids are going to grow up loving. Kids who grow up watching this movie today will probably love it, and in the future they'll watch it again, just like I watched Hook as a kid, where Bourne goes to visit the daughter of the parents that he now remembers murdering to ask for forgiveness because this girl has grown up thinking that her parents killed each other in a horrible argument. And I'm not just excited because I grew up loving most of these characters. Since I loved scary stuff as a kid and I've grown up continuing to love scary films and scary TV shows, it's about two men who grow up as basically brothers. They're not blood brothers, but they are that close. And that is a rare thing in films, to have this many films in which you can watch these characters quite literally grow up in front of you, trying to come to terms with the way he was raised and the environment that he grew up in and all of the hardships that come with that. When I grew up, I discovered The Sandlot because I rented it from the library, who maybe even grew up hearing about it and then watched it for the first time and said nothing happened. But as I'm sure a lot of you know, if you ever grew up with somebody, were friends with said person, and then you start going through puberty, that's when complications arise. This was such a great throwback to all those stupid action movies that I grew up with. And the young girl who grows up to be Britt Robertson eventually becomes great friends with this man, and it's really about their bond. This boy grows into Ben Affleck, so when he grows up, not only is he this incredibly smart person who can function at such a high level when it comes to things like math, he also can kick an absurd amount of ass. I grew up with the original, of course it was the American edited version with Raymond Burr. As someone who grew up with this character, I loved seeing him wreak havoc. Now let me get this right out of the gate. I never played with any of these toys growing up. It's almost like they were going for a metaphor of having to eventually leave your children behind, or having to eventually accept the fact that they've grown up. These guys grew up making films together, they've been friends forever. And the ending of this film showing Harry and Hermione and Ron grown up. And this film shows in great and excruciating detail how young Chiron can grow up in a very harsh environment, and that it explored youth and growing up in such an amazing way. I saw it and I liked it. This is a stunningly intimate movie that so beautifully examines how hard it can be for someone to grow up in an environment that doesn't understand him. I haven't seen a film in years that so perfectly captures the harsh urban environment that a lot of kids these days grow up in. And what I love about it is that I have never seen a film that goes through this specific storytelling beat of how a black man might grow up in a very harsh environment. I've wanted to talk about this movie forever on my channel. I grew up with this film. When I grow up and get married, I'm living alone. Do you hear me? I'm living alone! In its depiction of a boy growing up in a harsh urban environment.
It's one of those nostalgic movies. If you grew up with this kind of stuff, it means something to you. I specifically, however, have the Pioneer versions of the first three. Why is that? Because that's the version I grew up with first.
And possibly as she's even grown up into adulthood. That's going to be Japanese with English subtitles, but since we grew up with the dub, I think it's one of those animes that you kind of have to watch it with the dub, at least for us. Because this original VHS that I grew up with was heavily censored.
I enjoy historical science movies because that's what I was really into growing up.
And like, kids should grow up seeing stuff like this so that his life can eventually grow up to be better, but more importantly, so that this girl can be saved. My favorite superhero of all time, and Legos. These are both things I grew up with. See, I grew up in a very mixed race environment. I had tons of friends of color, so I never really saw this myself personally. I grew up in a very all-inclusive family. Guys, I grew up with King Kong. King Kong is something that's special to me. I grew up with this. The prevalent songs that we all grew up loving are still there in the film. Power Rangers has an
interesting history in America. A lot of people didn't know about this growing up, but this was originally a Japanese television show. If you guys saw my Hilariosity review of the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers movie from '95, then you know I grew up with this show. So people who grew up with the cartoon in the '80s who are now in their 30s or 40s are probably not going to find much to enjoy here. The Void is the latest '80s movie to come out today because everyone who was a kid in the '80s has now grown up and they can make movies. It also has two pretty good small minor supporting roles from Keenan, who I grew up watching Keenan and Kel.
They really just represent the era that I grew up in.
It's Stuckmann.